So I'm sure you could find 1,000 people to put up here to tell you how important your privacy is. All the bad things that are going to happen to you if you don't protect it. But here's a different viewpoint. Privacy is harmful. Greed requires privacy. I can only take something I don't deserve if I keep my accumulation hidden from you. Theft requires privacy. I can only take something that doesn't belong to me if I can keep my possessions a secret. Hate requires privacy. I can only convince you that someone different than you is evil if we keep our humanity hidden from one another. And war requires privacy. Only when the secrets of government are held can they convince citizens to fight and die for the secrets of other governments. Privacy isn't your friend. Privacy doesn't protect us. Privacy protects the things that harm us. We've been lulled to and tricked into believing that privacy is important. And worse than that, we've been told that it's an essential human condition. But the essential human condition of Homo sapiens abhors privacy. For 250,000 years, we lived with the complete absence of privacy. Men and women lived together every day of their lives, every second of their lives, in the complete absence of privacy. Privacy in those societies was synonymous with being lost, or being separated from one's group, or being outcast from your society, a situation of terrible consequence and tragedy. So for 96% of our human existence, privacy didn't exist. We lived in complete knowledge of our social collective. So what is the social collective? The social collective is the information that society has about each and every human being that belongs to it. It's not everything that we are as human beings. It's just the information that represents the differences and our uniquenesses amongst one another. So in our natural state, the social collective is small, or has been small. Hunter-gatherer societies were not very complicated. We didn't have complicated occupations or possessions. We lived very in close proximity. So the amount of information that would characterize a single person is probably only like a couple hundred things. But as time went on, the social collective grew. And by the time that there were the first towns, I suspect that it took 1,000 or maybe 10,000 data points in order to fully define a human being within society. And by the time the 19th century was around, we had specialized occupations and education, records. The amount of data to define a human being was in the millions. And by the end of last century, we were codifying our biology and we were recording the detailed communications of our lives. That information's in the billions. And only 13 years now into this century, we have the human genome, we have medical imaging, we have social networks, we have the cloud. The information's in the trillions for one human being. So how does that turn into privacy? Well, as time went on, we knew less and less of our social collective. And that's something that we long for. So institutions use this to great effect to create us and them. And us and them require privacy. It requires the notion that you do not share your differences with other people. Because if you do, there is no us and them. There's only we. So why us and them? Well, because things like greed and theft and hate and war require them. And many of our institutions cannot survive without those things. So when members of our society and our institutions sought to acquire wealth, power, services that were improper based upon their contribution, privacy was necessary to invoke. And that's a really powerful feed-forward mechanism if you think about it, because the moment that you start to hide your accumulation, you gain even more asymmetric means by which to acquire, necessitating even greater privacy. So how did privacy go from then till now? Let's take a quick tour. So for, like I said, about 240,000 years, privacy didn't exist. We lived in a state of complete knowledge of our social collective. But then societies began to grow. They began to spread out. The information per person grew. We became less and less connected with our social collective. And this was the state that institutions used to cause subgroups to coalesce. And it was easy because subgroups are kind of surrogates for that social collective that we really belong to. And here, privacy comes into being because individuals within those subgroups seek to gain more than they deserve. And us and them are the norm now. And it doesn't take long before we forget that the human social collective existed at all. The information per person continues to grow. Privacy starts to cement in those differences. We're sharing even less and less with one another. And now our culture is defined by things like distrust and hate and fear and war. And we live in this state for thousands of years. But our institutions thrive. But then a new force comes into the social collective, the Enlightenment. So an underlying philosophy of egalitarian human existence creates a gravity, creates something new that starts to force the false collectives back together. But at the same time, the amount of information is exploding. Now, information's at like 10 to the 6th, per person, and the amount of people that are like hundreds of millions. So the Enlightenment can't really crush the social collectives back together. It needs help. But then an inflection occurs. So communication and data processing suddenly advance more rapidly than the social collective. We see telegraph in 1833, we encircle the world with electronic communication in 1902. By the 1960s, we have widespread wireless technology, and by the 1990s, we have the internet and Web 1.0 kind of connecting the entire world. So all those barriers that I was talking about, the time and the distance and the number of people and the information, are all set to fall. So the Enlightenment has now found its champion. So where are we heading now? I believe we're heading back to the place that we began. We're coming full circle now. We're coming back to that place where we long to belong, to know the human social collective, to know what it is to be human in the greater sense, not some false version of it created by institutions for their own purpose. As Web 2.0 starts to collect all the information about the individual experience, it's becoming increasingly difficult for all the disparate subgroups to hide their false and private identities. And we're already seeing these new adopters basically living social norms that we would have never dreamt of before, with their lives out in the complete open. And to those of us who are taught that privacy was important, it's kind of shocking. But it's actually natural. It's actually the thing that we long for, that state that we lived in for so long, for 240,000 years. So whether we like it or not, I believe that the collapse of privacy and the subsequent collapse of all of the false collectives that exist is already happening all over the world at every imaginable scale. So let me share with you some examples. So when I was CEO of my last company, I had a bunch of young and smart employees. One of them was a young lady who I'll call Jane. And Jane really loved the San Diego nightlife. So much so that there were tons of pictures all over Facebook of her in various states of undress and intoxication. And one day I ran into Jane in the hallway and I mentioned to her, I've seen these pictures, and I wondered whether or not she thought that they were a good idea. And she said to me, doesn't everybody do that? And I was a little surprised. And I said, well, I don't think everybody's posting pictures of themselves on Facebook partying hard. And she said, no. Doesn't everyone have fun with their friends? It made me think, because I do like to have fun with my friends. But it's not always consistent with the very highly curated image of a CEO. But I think it's time that we start to ask why. I mean, who is it that we're lying to when we proffer the fantasy that our political leaders, our business leaders, the people we look up to, don't live lives filled with acts of being human? And why have we allowed somebody to say that those acts are shameful? And why do we allow a society to judge that which is actually natural to us? My second example is about transparency and inequity, because a lot of people will say that any argument for openness and transparency is essentially an argument for socialism or even communism. But that's not the case at all. So I've started 5 businesses in my life, and the most recent one, we decided that we were going to be 100% transparent with each and every person about who owns what and who makes what and all the features of that in our business. And as you can imagine, that leads to a lot of conversations about what is fair and why. But what I learned through that process was each and every person I talked to was completely willing to accept that there are different levels of responsibility, different levels of education, different roles, different kinds of experience that people bring to the table that warrant unequal compensation. So openness and transparency are entirely consistent with capitalism, just not unfair capitalism. Because what you can't do in an open and transparent system is use your knowledge or power over that system to materially benefit yourself in an unfair way. So former presidential candidate Mitt Romney learned this the hard way. A lot of people, lower and middle class people, were completely willing to accept that he was extraordinarily wealthy, mainly because he had distinguished himself so many ways in his lifetime. Where he fumbled with the inequity was when he invoked privacy over his tax returns. That didn't mean deserving to people, that meant unfair. So what about governments? So an often cited fear of privacy is the 1984 scenario, where central governments control the people in a very nefarious manner using their information. But I think that people who cite this are actually missing the point of Orwell, because it was actually the absolute secrecy of the government, not the transparency of the people, that led to this dystopia. I actually think 1984 is one of the greatest arguments against privacy that exists, because only when we as citizens are completely transparent are we going to be able to force our governments, which are essentially composed of citizens, to be completely transparent with us. And only then can we really expect benign leadership, because non-transparent governments are inherently unstable. If you fail to control information, they dissolve. Why? Because secrecy breeds corruption. And corruption breeds contempt of government. You only need to throw a little bit of transparency into that mix before you realize something explosive will happen. Take the Arab Spring. I mean, not even the totalitarian dictators of that region could kind of keep that Pandora's box closed. So when I think about problems like North Korea, I think that we ought to quit thinking about embargoes and start thinking about how to get everybody their mobile phone. Look at that. So what about the personal issues? I think that these are in many ways even more important than the government ones. Privacy advocates will say, oh, we shouldn't share our details with one another because society will persecute us. Well, I don't want to make light of the real risks and consequences there, but isn't that the tail wagging the dog? I mean, why do we accept a society essentially made of human beings that persecutes its people for its very diverse human nature? In fact, I actually believe that persecution exists because of privacy. It's when you're expected to keep your person and your preferences private that they can become secrets. And once it's secrets, they can be deemed wrong. And once wrong, they're worthy of persecution. Take gay rights, for example. The problem there has nothing to do with being gay. It comes from a cultural assertion that sex is private. But sex is so essentially human. I mean, hell or high water can come and we're still going to practice it and seek it and talk about it. So then what does society have to do? Well, we have to create a very sterile label of it so that we can talk about it. It's not going to go away. But in that very moment, you've passively decided that every other practice is deviant. And that's ridiculous, because one only needs to look at the many, many comprehensive surveys of human sexuality to conclude that there is no universal practice. But it doesn't matter, because the moment that you say that sex is private, you get all the discrimination and persecution for free. So Harvey Milk was actually right all the way from the beginning. By refusing to be private, the gay community has forced society to reckon with open human questions. And it's been really hard in open reckoning for anybody but the most recalcitrant to kind of accept that, there should be essential human tolerance for the sexual practices of adults. Even this year, we saw Senator Rob Portman, a conservative Republican and longtime opponent of gay marriage, change his position completely when he and his son brought forward the transparency of his son being gay. Natural human tolerance and understanding comes from a transparent view into human society and the human condition. So, I think we should worry a little bit about the institutions as privacy erodes. They will continue to resist it. They will continue to tell us that privacy protects us from things like greed and theft and hate and war. But are you sure? Because I believe that greed and theft and hate and war and many other things are actually supported by privacy. And so are those institutions that thrive on such things. The good news is that I don't think this is easily reversible. We're heading back to the place that we belong, back to that natural establishment, back to that natural order where we belong to humanity as a larger social collective. And so I'm left with two thoughts. The first one is that for the first time in 10,000 years, we have an opportunity to re-engage and bring the world back together, not with some false version of some sub-collective made by an institution for its own purposes, but by humanity. We're able to share the experiences of our lives with people all over the world and know them and understand them. And second, I think the changes that have happened because of this are already irreversible. They're emotionally and intellectually correct, and we will not let go of them now. We are heading back to that place that we dwelled in for so long, where we knew one another, not based upon societies, not based upon institutions, but as people. And in the meantime, there will be pioneers like Jane, living every day of her life in complete transparency for everyone to see, good or bad. Will this cause her problems? Will society judge her for this? I suspect so. At least until her generation is making the rules. And I think that's something to look forward to, because we should all have more fun with our friends. Thank you.